Asia. He is a PhD candidate in musicology and African studies. He looks at Afropolitan rhythms, popular music, and moving beyond money and style. You are welcome.
These white arrows?
It's, yes, right and left.
And this is the top?
That to show.
So this is a small portion of a chapter that's in the very early stages of writing, so we'll see how this goes. Shortly after I arrived in Johannesburg late in 2012, I visited the local bookstore in search of music magazines and other local publications. A glossy cover featuring Oliver Mtukudzi caught my eye. The magazine was titled The Afropolitan and had a Kaya FM radio station logo prominently featured in the upper left-hand corner. This was not, as it turned out, a music publication, but a more general lifestyle magazine catering to upwardly mobile, culturally savvy 30-somethings in and around South Africa. Some weeks later, I stumbled across an episode of the documentary series titled Tu's Children, which featured several young African leaders in various fields from around the continent. One of the individuals featured identified herself as an Afropolitan, and since then, the term periodically occupied my thoughts during my field research working with Malawian musicians in South Africa's world-class city. A year later, having completed my research in both South Africa and Malawi, with trips to Mozambique and Tanzania, I began to consider more seriously the term Afropolitan as a thought-provoking and potentially useful foil against which to write about social belonging and community ties that considered Africa as both multifaceted and emergent, as well as embracing different geographical scales, such as Southern Africa. As I pondered this in relation to music and musicians, I noticed that the musicians mentioned within the discourse of Afropolitanism in popular literature range from Femi Kuti to Spoke Matambo, typically favoring either young urban musicians fusing cosmopolitan and African elements in electronic dance music, hip-hop, and Afro-soul, or older classic artists like Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, and Oliver Mtukudzi. This seems to reflect trends in the music industry since the category of world beat receded in the early 2000s. It also speaks to the concerns of a number of musicians present at the 2013 Breathe Sunshine African Music Conference in Cape Town, where one panel was assembled to strategize how to get South African and African music on the national market without being relegated to the world music category. They addressed questions like, what is African music today? What does it mean to be a musician in Africa? Questions whose implications represent similar concerns addressed in debates over what is an Afropolitan and whether such a concept is useful. So I've chosen these two images simply to point out in contrast. I've taken like the similar type of category. They're both covers, they're not just casual shots. But you can see how Fela is highlighted as Fela Kuti, music is the weapon, whereas Spoke is much more of a business casual sort of look here. And even though these two artists are embraced by people who identify as Afropolitan, the Fela's music is also embraced by the more diaspora community and Pan-African sort of values. Whereas one issue was with like musicians now, in jazz especially, no longer have that resistance in their music, and so it's become soft. So you see this sort of shift to style rather than the message behind it. But I've chosen Spoke as well, and I'll show a sort of video clip, because he's very much concerned with his authenticity regardless of the influences. He's not really much concerned with what people expect of him and his art. But also his musical sound is very much congruent with what you often hear in Johannesburg in some of the clubs. the term Afropolitan, then, is a coinage popularized by Taiye Selasi in her article titled Bye Bye Babar, or What is an Afropolitan, which was originally published in Lit magazine in March 2005. In her article, Selasi describes the lives and worldviews of young women and men who have a mixture of national, racial, and cultural influences, amongst which African heritage is one. The article has since been reproduced in a number of internet publications, eliciting mostly praise and favorable reactions, but more recently some criticism. In a constellation of sometimes heated debates and occasional mystery, both advocates of and critics of Afropolitanism raise important issues that speak to the emergent realities of contemporary Africa. The word Afropolitan is indeed a combination of the terms African and cosmopolitan, thus addressing the shared cultural heritage of Africa while recognizing the citizen of the world aspect as typified by Selasi's oft-quoted statement, quote, we are Afropolitans, not citizens, but Africans of the world, unquote. The opening portion of Selasi's piece describes a social gathering at a club called the Medicine Bar in London. In her discussion, she includes musical references and uses phrases that employ various juxtapositions. For instance, Boy Genius DJ is spinning a Femi Kuti remix, fusing hip-hop dance moves with a funky sort of djembe, and sounds of African Lady over ludicrous bass lines. She sums this up stating the whole scene speaks of the cultural hybrid. Illustrating these hybrid characteristics, she describes various settings and individuals in terms of geographic associations that conspicuously avoid binaries. For instance, she writes, London meets Lagos meets Durban meets Dakar, and later speaks of a woman who lives in London but was raised in Toronto and born in Accra. Selasi describes various experiences and backgrounds that would typify those of Afropolitans, such as having a, quote, funny blend of London fashion, New York jargon, African ethics, and academic success, unquote. These descriptions and observations may call to mind a general theme concerning a new generation coming to terms with experiences that are at the nexus of African and Western societies. But I believe that would be missing her point, maybe as seen in this extended quote. The acceptance of complexity common to most African cultures is not lost on her prodigals. Without that intrinsically multi-dimensional thinking, we could not make sense of ourselves. What distinguishes this lot and its like in the West and at home is a willingness to complicate Africa, namely to engage with, critique, and celebrate the parts of Africa that mean most to them. Perhaps what most typifies the Afropolitan consciousness is the refusal to oversimplify the efforts to understand what is alien in Africa, alongside the desire to honor what is wonderful, unique. Rather than essentializing the geographical entity, we seek to comprehend the cultural complexity, to honor intellectual and spiritual legacy to sustain our parents' culture. Two other supporters and definers of Afropolitanism are Brendan Yakudia, editor of the Afropolitan magazine, and writer Mina Salami, the voice behind the blog Miss Afropolitan. Their particular positions within the media tend to provide them with leverage in asserting what an Afropolitan might be. Yakudia states that, quote, an Afropolitan is someone who has roots in Africa, raised by the world, but still has an interest in the continent and is making an impact, is feeding back into the continent and trying to make it better, unquote. She tends to place emphasis on one's outlook and personal commitment to Africa over their place of birth, cultural background, or having the right record collection. Mina Salami shares this sentiment, stating that Afropolitans are a group of people who are either of African origin or influenced by African culture, who are emerging internationally using African cultures in creative ways to change perceptions about Africa, unquote. One aspect that they touch upon is how Afropolitanism can serve as a positive way to counter narratives of Africa as a place of despair and corruption. Music, art, fashion design, and literature are mentioned as sites for such counter narratives. Yet this is one of the areas that generates criticism as well. Writing for the website Africa in Words, Stephanie Bar Santana states that Afropolitanism is, quote, a term that perhaps once held promise as a new theoretical lens, an important counterweight to Afro-pessimism, but what has increasingly come to stand for empty style and culture commodification, unquote. Similarly, Emma Daviri, in her January 2014 piece titled Why I'm Not an Afropolitan, develops an extensive critique of the tendency of Afropolitanism to be too rooted in commodification and consumerism. She reads Selasi's original and subsequent works as dwelling too much on what it is to be young, cool, and African. She also takes issue with the economic privilege that Selasi seems to gloss over. Davir asserts While a privileged position in itself is not problematic, it's the perpetuation of a singular narrative as the only counter to Afro-pessimism that is of concern. She explains that entangled in the notion of privilege, precision, and style is the fact that a small segment of the population is taking upon themselves to market their cultures while offering little to mitigate economic problems across classes. She quotes Frantz Fanon saying that a dual economy is not a developed economy. These problems are echoed by Okunodu Ogbechi commenting on the African fine art world and Wesipide on the African literary landscape. Ogbechi points out that literary critics that praise those writings for Afropolitan audiences about Afropolitan issues miss the point that there still remains aspects to African realities that are not pleasant, and by not writing about them, one risks erasing the concerns of a huge population. Wesipide, in his critique of Flow, it's an art exhibit that was held at Studio Museum in Harlem in 2008, stressed that artists, described as Afropolitans by other critics, were getting worthy praise, but lamented their failure to engage with the successful artists that earned critical acclaim on the continent, in Zimbabwe, Kenya, or Ghana. He asks why, in order for something to become mainstream, must it be on North America's or Europeans' terms? In Malawi, the term Afropolitan rarely comes up, if at all. But in the 2 decades following multi-party elections in 1994, there's been several rising figures in business and entertainment. Many people are sons and daughters of an older generation that left the repressive dictatorship of Kamuzu Banda and resemble in character the people that Taiye Selasi describes as Afropolitans in her article. But there are other similarly diverse and complicated people who won't be found at the Medicine Bar in London, but who also stand in opposition to pessimistic narratives of Africa. Lloyd Paundi, performing under the name Agaroso, is an acoustic guitar player and singer-songwriter who hails from Nsanje along the Mozambican border and currently resides in Malawi's industrial hub of Blantyre. Speaker of English, Chichewa, and Sena, prefers to walk from place to place when he can in order to talk to people he runs into. He is also the winner of the 2013 Africa Movie Academy Award for Best Soundtrack for the film The Last Fishing Boat. He conveyed to me that while he received favorable press in Malawi and traveled to Nigeria to accept his award, he cannot understand why cell phone companies and other corporations were throwing parties for the Malawian contestants appearing on Big Brother Africa. He says, they weren't even runners-up. I mean, I won, and they were throwing them parties. And here's some of his music. Agaroso's music is emerging at a time in Malawi when many individuals there are actively engaging in the reimagining of what Malawi is, each in their own terms. Notions of progress vary from one person to the next, but serious inquiry is occurring in a way that is markedly different from when I first went to Malawi during the Kamuzu era some 22 years ago. As the narratives of African success become more diversified and the binary constructs become less rigid, may the supply of pens writing those narratives continue to be widely available, regardless of geographies or social strata. I ask that we also consider commercial music as an art form whose value system includes economic gain, but is not necessarily devoid of artistic and intellectual concerns. Let us look beyond the gloss of fashion and style and embrace the potential that the expressive arts have to act as harbingers of larger social change, even in an era of hyper-consumerism and culture commodification.